My Govanid. Welcome to Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and we just celebrated, or not celebrated, depending on the level of shutdown in your area, Halloween 2020. And in case you just haven't gotten enough of spooks and thrills and things like that, because a lot of us didn't get much of that, in this video I'm going to be going over the creepiest creatures in Tolkien's mythology. I've done a previous video on scariest scenes from the Lord of the Rings, and I can link to that in the description below if you want some more Halloween-related material. But for this video, I'm going to be focusing on specific creatures, things, whatever, that are really, really scary by themselves, not necessarily the scenes. And to make it a little more Halloween-themed even than that, I'm going to be talking about what kind of horror movie each of them would feature in, just to make it a little more interesting. So let's get started. First, of course, we can't have ghouls, ghosts, and goblins and things like that without ghosts. Good old classic ghost story is pretty much a prerequisite for any kind of good haunting or spooky-themed anything. So what were the ghosts, of course? Those would be the dead men of Dunharrow. You know who I'm talking about. All those ghosts that Aragorn goes and fetches to add to his arsenal as he makes his way south into Gondor. Now, the movie and the book versions of these are rather different in the sense that in the book, they don't go all the way to Minas Tirith. They help him take the ships from the Corsairs, and that's it. But, I mean, ultimately, they're basically the same. Now, what's more interesting, though, as a difference between the book and the movie, is in the book, they don't ever really do any fighting as far as we can tell. Basically, as soon as they even advance anywhere near any living humans, the living humans that they get near are so terrified that they run away. Very few do anything other than that. In fact, it tells us that when Aragorn first gets out of the Paths of the Dead and, begins to go through the realm of Gondor, people who live in the region shutter their doors and don't go out. Like, they're not even necessarily on the path or anything, but, they're all staying home and not going anywhere. And then they finally actually start engaging with bad guys, and, those pretty much all run and flee in terror. So, unlike in the movie where we can see them actually kind of inflicting harm somehow on bad guys, that doesn't seem to really happen so much in the book. They're literally just using terror as a weapon, which is interesting because that's usually something you associate with, the Nazgul or other enemies, not necessarily with allies. Of course, these aren't necessarily the friendliest allies, so that may be why. Sticking with classic movie types, we've got your classic monster movies, the Wolfman, Dracula, and that sort of thing. And for that, we have vampires and werewolves. Now, vampires in Tolkien's world almost certainly are not Dracula-type vampires, humans that transform into bats, but rather probably, it's not really ever explicitly stated, but probably are just like minor Ainur or Maiar who inhabit Middle-earth, who take the form of giant bats. One of these is a messenger from Sauron to Morgoth in the Silmarillion, and Luthien, whenever they take over Sauron's tower, ends up using the skin of one of these to disguise herself on their way to Morgoth. And similarly, Beren ends up wearing a wolfhame. Now again, werewolves, not necessarily, a wolf that transforms into a man with the moon or something like that. Probably more like just a wolf-like thing that is also kind of man-like. And depending on, this one's a little bit fudgy because you do have, different older versions of the Silmarillion stories in which these things are a little bit more explicitly werewolf, whereas in the Silmarillion as published, it's not so clearly a werewolf type thing. They're just really, really nasty wolves. But I'm counting it anyway because, it's a classic horror movie trope, and why not? This next one is kind of going to bleed categories because it's really kind of a 3-in-1. Spiders. Now, of course, you've got 3 different categories of spiders in Tolkien's world. You've got the spiders in Mirkwood, and you've got Shelob, and then you've got Shelob's mama, Ungoliant. Ungoliant is, you know, at one stage in the Silmarillion, seemingly equally powerful as Morgoth, and that's a really big deal. And not only that, but like the way she's described is like really almost otherworldly. She eats light and spins darkness, and just a really creepy character all around. And so in that way, Ungoliant is almost like an old gods or supernatural type horror movie. Think one of the more recent examples I can think of would be the Netflix movie, or was it series? I forget now. The Ritual, and I think it was just a movie. But anyway, that's kind of the same idea there. Well, if you haven't seen it, I won't spoil anything. But you've got, you know, movies out there that are like, you know, you run into old gods or things like that, or for like a funny take on that, you've got The Cabin in the Woods, which is a parody of typical horror movies, and it's, you know, like literally there's old gods that demand human sacrifices, and horror movies turn out to be the way that they manage this. So it's a really interesting movie to watch if you haven't seen it. Shelob is kind of bleeding into less, you know, overarching cosmic, you know, significance type stuff, but still a very significant enemy and a very powerful one. But it starts to bleed into what I would categorize the Mirkwood spiders as, which is kind of like your B-movie horror monster. So, I mean, you know, some of those really old monster movies with giant insects and all that kind of thing, that's where you would probably find these guys. Shelob kind of straddles the line between that and the Ungoliant Old Gods type horror movie, but, you know, wherever you want to place Shelob on that spectrum, it doesn't really matter. Now, along similar lines that you could maybe put in that old gods type idea is the balrog. And of course, the balrog, one of the things that we tend to forget, I think, in the age of Peter Jackson's movies is that the balrog is not even so much scary just because he's big and powerful. That's true. But in the book, if you read the description, it also says a terror goes before it. So again, there's that idea, you know, fear kind of exuding from this thing, kind of like the Nazgul. So you could kind of place it in that category, but also because it's like a really big, bad warrior type enemy, you could even kind of maybe put it in the slasher film category and say that he's just, you know, like a murder machine. Kind of sits in his own little hideaway and waits to do his thing, but when he comes out, kill count's probably going to be pretty high. And we already have a pretty good reason to think that his kill count for dwarves is mighty high. And, you know, there's probably lots of other things that the Balrog has killed too. But, you know, there's definitely also that old gods kind of side to it because he's an ancient horror from, you know, the elder days and all that stuff. You know, not quite on the level of Ungoliant, but still pretty scary stuff. Since we're talking about Moria, we might as well talk about the other major monster from the Moria sequence of events, and that is the Watcher in the Water. Now, this one is where we get into your Lovecraftian, cosmic horror, Cthulhu type stuff, because the Watcher is kind of an unknown. We don't really know what it is, but it seems unearthly and really just dangerous in a lot of ways. And of course, the fact that it's seemingly squid-like makes it fit with the idea of a Cthulhu type villain anyway. So the only thing we really know about this is that it's there in the water and it's got tentacles. In the movie, we get a view of its face. In the book, that never actually happens. The only thing they ever see is the tentacles. So then later on, they read in the book of Mazarbul, which is the watch chamber where they end up spending the night, and they find this old battered book. They read in there some comments by whichever scribe, I forget, Owen, Feely? No, not Feely. One of the dwarves was keeping records and mentions the Watcher in the Water. And of course, it's like, oh, we think we know what that is. But whatever it is, even the name Watcher in the Water almost gives you kind of that Lovecraftian sense of like something almost otherworldly, not really quite belonging to where we are. Now, there is one other thing I should mention about Moria while we're on the topic, because when Gandalf starts talking about well, just after the escape from the Watcher in the Water, they get into Moria and they have no real way out other than going through it. And Gandalf mentions that there are older and fouler things than orcs. You may remember that line from the movie. In the book, he says that there are nameless things that gnaw in the deep, and that they are, even Sauron knows them not because they are older than he. Now, here we get this idea of older than Sauron. That, strictly speaking, I don't think Gandalf means that literally in the sense that they pre-existed Sauron. Sauron, being an Ainu or a Maya, goes back to the very beginning. Probably what Gandalf means here is that they are older in Middle-earth than Sauron is. Sauron hasn't been in Middle-earth as long as these things have. So who knows what they are? Gandalf doesn't hint at what they are. Maybe Gandalf doesn't even know what they are. Who knows what Gandalf is even referring to here. But here we can kind of get into the suspense kind of category. And you don't get this in the movie, obviously, because he doesn't reference any of this other than the comment about older and fouler things than orcs. But he's not. In the movie, we can interpret that as meaning the balrog. That's kind of easy. In the book, he's obviously talking about things other than the balrog. And when he tells Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli his story about, fighting the balrog in the depths of the earth and whatnot, he even mentions things that, there are things down there that nobody's ever seen before. Not clear exactly what he's talking about, but one suspects that maybe Gandalf saw some of these nameless things that even Sauron knows not. But because of the way the story progresses in the book, and after seeing the Watcher in the Water, and the entire Fellowship is on edge, there is definitely this sense of creeping suspense. And then when Pippin throws a rock into a well, a little bit unlike the movie, you don't get this huge rush of goblins right after that. You, in fact, get like a tapping, tap, 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 tap. And everybody's wondering, like, what is that? So, there's, is that one of the nameless things that dwells, in the depths of the earth? Nobody knows, but it keeps building this sense of suspense. And this, the suspense horror movie is one of those things where it's like, you never really know what's coming until maybe right at the end, and then you finally find out what the horrible thing is. We never find that out in The Lord of the Rings, but it's suspenseful nonetheless. Now this one is going to be it kind of fits in monster movie, but not maybe so much horror. But the mounts for the winged ring wraiths, or the winged nazgul, based on their description and even some of what Tolkien wrote in his letters, you get this idea that he had something like a pterodactyl or an ancient flying dinosaur in mind. And even the way that it's written in The Lord of the Rings, you can kind of draw that inference, because it makes a comment about they're like the last vestige of some older life form that's just kind of, these are the last ones, and Sauron took it and bred it and made it into whatever it is. So it's not really clear exactly if it's like an ancient dinosaur type thing, but it could be. And this to me seems to fit best in the category of like a Godzilla type monster movie. You've got these really old monsters or things like monsters that have somehow survived into the present day. And the description of it, again, in the movies, you just kind of see them and they're like kind of weird looking and whatever. In the book, you do get the idea that when the Witch King actually comes and attacks Éowyn, that it's more than just a creature. It's there's something about it that just is really off-putting. Part of that is because it's when they encounter it, when Éowyn encounters it on the field, it says that it stank. So it's giving off a really bad odor. And typically speaking in Tolkien, if there's something, a negative attribute about something, that's usually a good indication that it's kind of just evil. Now, made evil by Sauron or evil by nature, we could leave that up for debate. But the idea is, at least at this point in its life, it's kind of an evil thing, and it's not pleasant. And of course, that brings us to the Nazgul themselves. The Nazgul technically are just men who have been corrupted and enslaved and made into wraiths by their possession of the 9 rings of power. But because of that process, they have been made into something more than just human, or you might say less than just human. They are in some ways very similar to the dead men of Dunharrow. They are, in a literal sense, ghosts. They exist, but you can't see them. And, you know, just that's actually true in the book of the dead men of Dunharrow as well. In the movie, you can see the dead men of Dunharrow. In the book, you can't. And similarly with the nazgul, they're not actually visible unless they put on clothes. But they are not really the same as the dead men of Dunharrow, because their reason for being a wraith is not that they have died and been cursed, it's because they've never died at all and just kind of slipped into being whatever they are. But they're interesting because they are, like the dead men of Dunharrow, terrifying in and of themselves, and especially when gathered together. And that's another thing about them that seems to be different than the dead men of Dunharrow. There's something about the ring wraiths as a collective that is kind of unique, and they still have something about them that is in a way more human, but also they're less human because they are completely enslaved to the ring. But the movie category that I would put these in is the possession category, you know, the exorcist and that sort of thing, because they're not technically free agents. They have been taken over. They are being controlled. But it's because of that control by another power, namely Sauron, at least in part, that they are now terrifying and completely otherworldly. You know, they don't do things like a lot of the possessed people in possession type movies do, but it is nevertheless the case that because of their relationship to the thing that is controlling them, or the person that's controlling them, that they are now superhuman and, you know, like I said, in a way less than human, and therefore terrifying. So the Nazgul kind of round out my list. So that is my look at the creepiest creatures in Middle-earth. Did I miss anything? Please leave any comments in the comments below. Tell me what I missed, and what, you know, if I did miss something, tell me what kind of movie you would, you know, put that in as a, you know, monster movie or whatever it is. Again, you know, the possession thing, that's not really a monster movie per se, but it's still a horror type movie. So whatever kind of movie that you think it would fit, tell me. If you know, can come up with one that I didn't mention, what kind of movie it would be. Should be fun to read some of that stuff if you can come up with any. If you enjoyed the video, please do give it a thumbs up, share it around to anybody else who is also desperate for more Halloween scares. And if you want to follow me on Twitter at JRRTLore, you can catch some occasional Tolkien-related trivia questions. You can subscribe to the channel here and support the channel here, and find 2 of my previous videos here. Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namaste.